The same gender differences are found among the Japanese. The evidence for these basic differences in self-construal is diverse. When women describe themselves, they are more likely than men to refer to social characteristics and relationships. When selecting photographs that are most revealing of who they are, women are more likely than men to choose photos that include other people, such as friends and family members. In social interactions, women tend to be more empathic and better judges of other people's personalities and emotions. Men tend to be more attuned to their own internal responses, such as increased heart rate, whereas women are more attuned to situational cues, such as other people's reactions. Where do these gender differences in self-construal come from? Socialization processes are one influential source. Parents raise girls and boys differently. For example, parents tend to talk with their girls more than with their boys about emotions and being sensitive to others. The friendships that people form from the earliest ages also influence gender differences in self-construal. Starting at age 3 and continuing through the primary school years, girls and boys tend to play in gender-segregated groups that reinforce and amplify the differences in self-construal. Girls tend to focus on cooperative games that are oriented toward interpersonal relationships, for example, mother and child. Boys tend to emphasize competition, hierarchy, and distinctions among individuals. As adults, gender-specific roles further amplify these differences. For example, even today, Western women take on most of the responsibilities for raising children, which calls on interdependent tendencies. These gendered roles are portrayed in the media as well, which tend to showcase men in positions of power and agency and women in more nurturing roles. These aspects of socialization tend to reinforce and enhance biological differences between the sexes that make females more inclined to be nurturing and males more inclined to be competitive and aggressive. And you may recall from Chapter 1 that some cultures maximize these predispositions well beyond what is characteristic of a hunter-gatherer culture, whereas others minimize them, some to the point of near zero temperamental differences. Social comparison. Sometimes people actively seek out information about themselves through comparison with other people. This is the central tenet of social comparison theory, an influential and enduring theory in social psychology put forward by Leon Festinger in the 1850s. The theory maintains that when people have no objective standard by which to evaluate their traits or abilities, they do so largely by comparing themselves with others. Whether you are physically strong can be determined fairly objectively by simple tests of strength, but to be honest or morally upright, dimensions that are not so easy to quantify objectively, is to be more honest and morally upright than others. Festinger noted, however, that there is no point in comparing yourself with Neil deGrasse Tyson or Serena Williams, nor is it very helpful to compare yourself with total novices. To get an accurate sense of how good you are at something, you need to compare yourself with people who have roughly your level of skill. Social comparison theory. The idea that people compare themselves to other people to obtain an accurate assessment of their own opinions, abilities, and internal states. It is not enough to succeed, others must fail. Gore Vidal. Box 3.3. Focus on culture. Social class shapes the social self. Stevens and her colleagues propose that life in different social class subcultures in the United States promotes the elaboration of distinct construals of the self. Living in relatively higher class environments, with their more abundant resources, safer neighborhoods, greater access to education, higher job security, and so on, affords people with the opportunity, if not the mandate, to develop selves that reflect the U.S. cultural ideal of independence. This independent self-construal emphasizes choice, freedom from constraint, the pursuit of opportunities, and self-expression. In contrast, the culture of lower-class individuals in the United States is characterized by fewer resources, less safe neighborhoods, limited access to education, and tenuous job security. In such circumstances, the Stevens team argues, it makes sense that people would develop selves that are more sensitive to the social context, to the constraints in the environment, and to their dependence on others. Among lower-class individuals, a more socially responsive, interdependent kind of self-construal is promoted. Do such class differences matter? Because the norms and values of many U.S. institutions reflect the ideal of independence, people who hold an independent self-construal and think and behave accordingly are at an advantage, and one that serves to perpetuate social class differences. For example, in most American schools, administrators and teachers reward behavior associated with an independent self-construal, such as standing out from the pack. It's hardly surprising, then, that students whose social class promotes an independent self-construal have better academic achievement outcomes than those raised in a social class that encourages interdependence. Researchers have begun to explore ways to promote the growth and development of lower-class individuals and, accordingly, help close the social class achievement gap. Stevens, Hamadani, and Destin, 2014, studied a group of incoming first-generation college students who do not have parents with four-year degrees and who are disproportionately in the lower class, and a group of continuing generation students, those who have at least one parent with a four-year degree. Both groups listened to one of two panels of first-generation and continuing generation, junior and senior students, sharing stories about their college experiences. Panelists in one condition described the ways their social class backgrounds had had both positive and negative effects, emphasizing the importance of using strategies that take into account their different social class status. Panelists in the other condition also shared stories about their college experiences, but did not highlight the role of their social class. Remarkably, the typical academic achievement gap seen between first and continuing generation students was eliminated among students exposed to the difference education panel. The data suggests that the elimination of this gap occurred because the intervention increased the likelihood that first-generation students would seek out resources, such as emailing a professor for help, and, as a result, improved their grades. More research is, of course, needed, but findings like these at least raise the possibility that even relatively simple interventions can help level the playing field for individuals who tend to hold an interdependent self-construal, yet are faced with situations tailored to reward independence. Social class shapes the nature of the social self, but does not have to determine life outcomes. Class differences and the social self. Higher and lower class individuals often inhabit very different environments, as shown by these photos of an upper class neighborhood on the left and a lower class neighborhood on the right. So on the left, the upper class neighborhood is like people biking in a nice, like, gentrified suburb, and on the right, it's like kind of ghetto, like a shed, and people hanging out together with like dogs and garbage. Numerous studies have shown that people are indeed especially drawn to comparisons with similar others. We like to feel good about ourselves, though, so our search for similar targets of comparison tends to be biased toward people who are slightly inferior to or worse off than ourselves. This is ironic because it puts us in the position of saying, compared with people who are slightly worse at tennis than I am, I'm pretty good. Or, compared with people who are almost as conscientious as I'm pretty darn conscientious. These sorts of downward social comparisons help us define ourselves favorably, giving a boost to our self-esteem. But if we only engage in downward social comparison, we sacrifice opportunities for improvement. In fact, when our focus is on improving ourselves, we tend to forego the self-esteem benefits of downward social comparison and engage in upward social comparison instead. For example, in one study that examined the social comparisons made by a group of ninth graders, researchers found that students usually chose to compare their grades with those of someone who had slightly better grades than they did, presumably with the hope that one day they might get higher grades themselves. Social comparisons. It's not informative to compare your intelligence or athletic skill to someone renowned for brilliance, such as Neil deGrasse Tyson, or celebrated for tennis playing ability, like Serena Williams. In today's social media-crazed world, we can find ourselves bombarded with social comparison opportunities. Pictures of your friend's happy romantic relationship pop up on your Facebook feed. Your smartphone pings to let you know that your neighbor has just shared a stunning video of her exotic vacation. A former classmate tweets that his company just landed a prestigious new account. You wouldn't be alone if such events made you wonder, why am I not in a relationship? Is my relationship as perfect as other people's relationships? Was my last vacation really that much fun? How more or less successful am I? This self-doubt raises the question of whether exposing yourself to all of this social media is good or bad for you. Researchers have begun to tackle this question. In one study, Verduin and colleagues, 2015, text messages participants 5 times a day over a 6-day period, prompting them to fill out a survey upon receiving each text. The survey asked participants to make a series of ratings, including their current affective well-being, how positive or negative they felt, their amount of passive use of Facebook since the last text, for example, scrolling through their newsfeed, their amount of active use of Facebook since the last text, for example, posting and sharing links, and finally, in an effort to measure social comparison, their current feelings of envy. The findings suggest that passive, but not active, Facebook use makes one feel less upbeat, and that this is due in part to feelings of envy, presumably triggered by comparing one's own life with the images of other people's lives splashed all over one's Facebook feed. Results like these point to social media as a potentially major social influence on construals and evaluations of the self. Looking back, the social self originates from a variety of sources. Socialization agents, by virtue of what they teach us, what they encourage in us, how they react to us, help define who we are. The current situation matters as well. The social self shifts from one context to another. A person's cultures, country of residence, gender, race, social class shape the social self in profound ways, leading to defining the self in more independent terms, with an emphasis on uniqueness and autonomy, or in more interdependent terms, with an emphasis on connection to others. Finally, the social self is shaped by comparisons with other people. Self-esteem. In 1987, California Governor George Deukmejian signed Assembly Bill 3659 into law. The bill allocated an annual budget of $245,000 for a self-esteem task force charged with 2 goals: understanding the effects of self-esteem on drug use, teenage pregnancy, and high school dropout rates, and elevating the self-esteem of school children. The initiative was based on the assumption that strengthening self-esteem would help cure society's ills. Several findings would seem to support this assumption. People with low self-esteem are less satisfied with life, more hopeless, and more depressed, and they are less able to cope with life's challenges, such as the social and academic demands of college. They tend to disengage from tasks following failure, and they are more prone to antisocial behavior and delinquency. Raising self-esteem, the thinking was, just might produce healthier, more resilient children and a better society in the long run. Much of the data that the California legislators relied on was correlational in nature, which means we can't conclude that self-esteem had a causal effect on any of the other variables. Regardless, the topic of self-esteem has attracted considerable attention by social psychologists. Defining self-esteem. Self-esteem refers to the overall positive or negative evaluation people have of themselves. Researchers usually evaluate self-esteem with simple self-report measures like the scale in Table 3.1. As you can see from this scale, self-esteem represents how we feel about our attributes and qualities, our successes and failures, and ourself in general. People with high self-esteem feel quite good about themselves. People with low self-esteem feel ambivalent about themselves. They tend to feel both good and bad about who they are. People who truly dislike themselves are rare and are typically found in specific clinical populations, such as severely depressed individuals. Self-esteem, the overall positive or negative evaluation people have of themselves. Trait self-esteem is a person's enduring level of self-regard across time. Studies indicate that trait self-esteem is fairly stable. People who report high trait self-esteem at one point in time tend to report high trait self-esteem many years later. People who report low trait self-esteem at one point tend to report low trait self-esteem later. Life is not easy for any of us, but what of that? We must have perseverance and, above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something and that this thing must be attained. Marie Curie. State self-esteem refers to the dynamic, changeable self-evaluations a person experiences as momentary feelings about the self. Much of your working self-concept changes from one context to the next. So, too, can your state self-esteem. When people experience a setback, their self-esteem is likely to take a dive, especially among those who have low self-esteem to begin with. For example, when college students watch their beloved college football team lose, their feelings of personal competence often drop, and children of average intelligence have lower self-esteem when they're in a classroom with academically talented children, rather than with children who have lower academic abilities. Self-esteem also shifts during different stages of development. As males move from early adolescence, age 14, to early adulthood, age 23, their self-esteem tends to rise. During the same period, female self-esteem tends to fall. Table 3.1, Self-Esteem Scale. Indicate your level of agreement with each of the following statements by using the scale below. 0, strongly disagree. 1, disagree. 2, agree. 3, strongly agree. 1, at times I think I am no good at all. 2, I take a positive view of myself. 3, all in all, I am inclined to feel that I am a failure. 4, I wish I could have more respect for myself. 5, I certainly feel useless at times. 6, I feel that I am a person of worth, at least on an equal plane with others. 7, on the whole, I am satisfied with myself. 8, I feel I do not have much to be proud of. 9, I feel that I have a number of good qualities. 10, I am able to do things as well as most other people. To determine your score, first reverse the scoring for the 5 negatively worded items, 1, 3, 4, 5, and 8, as follows. 0 equals 3, 1 equals 2, 2 equals 1, 3 equals 0. Then add up your scores across the 10 items. Your total score should fall between 0 and 30. Higher numbers indicate higher self-esteem. Success and failure in different domains do not affect everyone equally. Some people attach more importance to doing well in some domains, such as popularity, academics, physical appearance, or moral virtue, than others. According to Jennifer Crocker's Contingencies of Self-Worth model, people's self-esteem rises and falls with successes and failures in the domains in which they have staked their self-worth. In other words, self-esteem goes up when you do well in areas that matter to you, but drops when you stumble in these areas. Contingencies of self-worth. A perspective maintaining that people's self-esteem is contingent on the successes and failures in domains on which they have based their self-worth. In a test of this prediction, researchers studied the self-esteem of University of Michigan students who had applied to graduate school. They asked students to fill out a self-esteem questionnaire every day that they received an acceptance or rejection response from a graduate school. Not surprisingly, students had higher self-esteem on days when they received an acceptance and lower self-esteem on days when they received a rejection. But these effects were much larger for those students whose self-esteem was highly dependent on academic competence. These findings suggest that it's probably wise for people to stake their self-worth in a wide range of areas, perhaps on academic achievement, but also on the strength of their friendships and family relationships, their ability to play a particular sport or musical instrument, their concern for the feelings of others, and so on, rather than put all their eggs in one basket. Indeed, studies suggest that to the extent we derive our self-worth from multiple domains that are distinct from one another, the more likely we are to avoid feeling devastated by a setback in any one domain. Elevating self-esteem. People in the self-esteem movement feel it is important for all children to have high self-esteem so that they will be happy and healthy. They have encouraged teachers to make every child a VIP for a day, and coaches to give medals or trophies to every child who plays on a team, whether the team wins or loses. Social acceptance and self-esteem. Several of the domains that define people's self-worth, for example, social approval, are highly social in nature. In his sociometer hypothesis, Mark Leary maintains that self-esteem is primarily a readout of our likely standing with others. That is, self-esteem is an internal, subjective index of how well we are regarded by others, and hence how likely we are to be included or excluded by them. Throughout most of evolutionary history, Leary reasons, we couldn't go it alone. Therefore, we needed a way to quickly assess how we were doing socially. Our feelings of state self-esteem constitute just such an assessment. Leary notes that those things that make us feel good about ourselves, feeling likable, competent, physically attractive, and morally upright, are precisely those things that make others accept us or reject us if we fall short. High self-esteem indicates that we are thriving in our relationships. Low self-esteem suggests that we are having interpersonal difficulties. In this sense, low self-esteem is not something to be avoided at all costs. Rather, it provides useful information about what we need to attend to and shore up our social bonds. Sociometer hypothesis. The idea that self-esteem is an internal, subjective index or marker of the extent to which a person is included or looked on favorably by others. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. Hitch your wagon to a star. Insist on yourself. Never imitate. The individual is the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Men resemble the times more than they resemble their fathers. Arab proverb. Culture and self-esteem. Many East Asian languages have no word or phrase for self-esteem. The Japanese have a term now, but like the Japanese rendering for baseball, namely beseboru, the word for self-esteem is simply borrowed from English, serufu etsutimu. The fact that it was Westerners who invented the term self-esteem reflects a long-standing concern in the West with the value of the individual. During the Enlightenment period in the 1700s, Western Europeans began to prioritize individuality, freedom, and rights, ideas that would weave their way into the U.S. Constitution. Today, the emphasis on self-esteem in the West is higher than ever. Bookstores are filled with books about the importance of having a strong sense of self-worth. Modern American parents want to raise independent and confident children, not the obedient children of 50 years ago. Independent cultures foster higher levels of self-esteem than interdependent cultures. Compared with the world's more interdependent peoples, from Japan to Malaysia to India to Kenya, Westerners report higher self-esteem and a more pronounced concern with evaluating the self. It's not that people who define the self in more interdependent terms feel bad about themselves. Rather, they're more concerned with other ways of feeling good about themselves. For example, they're motivated towards self-improvement and commitment to collective goals. Interestingly, as people from interdependent cultures are increasingly exposed to the West, the independent emphasis on self-worth rubs off on them and their self-esteem rises. As shown in Figure 3.5, as Asians become more immersed in Canadian life, they become more like Canadians in general with respect to self-esteem. So, when he says, "What a good boy am I?" Jack is really reinforcing his self-esteem. Independence is happiness. Susan B. Anthony. America is a vast conspiracy to make you happy. John Updike. What is it about independent and interdependent cultures that creates these differences? A situationist hypothesis would be that people from Western cultures create social interactions that enhance self-esteem. Consistent with this notion, studies have found that situations described by Japanese as common daily experiences are seen as less conducive to high self-esteem by both Japanese and Americans than daily situations in the United States. Figure 3.5. Cultural change and shifts in self-esteem. The graph represents a number of groups. Japanese are those who live in Japan. Being abroad Japanese are those who have spent time in a Western culture. Recent Asian immigrants are those who moved to Canada within the last 7 years prior to the study. Long-term Asian immigrants have lived in Canada for more than 7 years. Second-generation Asian Canadians were born in Canada, but their parents were born in Asia. Third-generation Asian Canadians were born in Canada, and their parents were born in Canada, but their grandparents were born in Asia. European Canadians are Canadians whose ancestors were Europeans. We have self-esteem score, then the cultural sample of Japanese, been abroad Japanese, recent Asian immigrants, long-term Asian immigrants, second-generation Asian Canadians, third-generation Asian Canadians, and European Canadians. So by the time someone gets to a third-generation Asian Canadian, their self-esteem is the same as a European Canadian. It just keeps positively correlating the more time that they spend in the West. Self-esteem in Asians increases as a function of the degree of their exposure to North American culture. For example, Japanese people are more often encouraged to engage in assisted self-criticism than Americans are. Japanese math teachers and sushi chefs critique themselves in sessions with their peers, not the sort of activities that tend to build self-esteem, however beneficial they might be to skill development. Situations Americans reported as typical, by contrast, are seen by both Americans and Japanese to be more esteem-enhancing. For example, Americans are more often praised for their achievements than Japanese people are. Cultural differences in the emphasis on promoting self-esteem versus improving the self can have important consequences for how people respond to failures and setbacks. Stephen Hain and his colleagues asked Canadian and Japanese students to take a so-called creativity test and then gave them false performance feedback. Some were told they had performed well, while others were told they had performed badly. The experimenters then gave the participants the opportunity to work on a similar task. The Canadians worked longer on the second task if they had succeeded at the first. The Japanese worked longer if they had failed. The Canadians thus avoided being reminded of failure, and the Japanese used the occasion to improve. Culture and self-esteem. Japanese students are encouraged to focus on how they can improve more so than how to feel good about themselves, an emphasis that may help explain cultural differences in levels of self-esteem. Looking back, self-esteem refers to the positive or negative evaluation people have of themselves. Trait self-esteem is fairly stable, whereas state self-esteem fluctuates across different situations. People have different contingencies of self-worth, domains in which they invest their self-esteem. These lead to rises or declines in self-esteem when they succeed or fail, respectively, in these domains. According to the sociometer hypothesis, self-esteem is a gauge of a person's standing with others and thus a useful potential warning about the possibility of rejection. People who construe the self in more interdependent terms are less concerned with feeling positively about their attributes than are modern Westerners, who define the self in more independent terms. Defining the self in interdependent terms is also associated with being more likely to seek opportunities for self-improvement. Motivations behind self-evaluation. Everyone spends some time evaluating their abilities and skills, but different motives can drive these evaluations. Whereas the man scrutinizing himself in the mirror seems to be taking a self-critical stance toward himself, others evaluate the self through rose-colored glasses. Motives driving self-evaluation. Implicit in our discussion of self-esteem is the fact that people are motivated to view themselves positively. This motive, known as self-enhancement, influences many processes related to self-evaluation, including how people respond to negative feedback about their own personality and what kinds of information they seek out. Another important motivating factor in evaluating oneself is self-verification. Self-enhancement. Suppose you just found out that your romantic interest in a coworker is not reciprocated, or you recently received a less than stellar performance appraisal at work. Naturally, you're going to feel bad about yourself and will probably try to find ways to feel better. In other words, there will be a need for self-enhancement, the desire to maintain, increase, or protect positive views of the self. To satisfy this very powerful motive, people use various strategies. Self-enhancement, the desire to maintain, increase, or protect one's positive self-views. Self-serving construals, As we've already discussed, most people, or at least most Westerners, tend to view themselves positively. In fact, when asked to indicate how they compare with others on various dimensions, people exhibit a pronounced better than average effect. They think they are above average in popularity, kindness, fairness, leadership, and so on. And it will probably not surprise you to learn that most people think they are above average drivers. A majority of drivers interviewed, while hospitalized for being in an automobile accident, rated their driving skill as closer to expert than to poor. Why are people so upbeat about themselves? Part of the answer has to do with how people interpret what it means to be kind, fair, athletic, or even a good driver. That is, self-serving interpretations of these kinds of traits are one means of pursuing self-enhancement. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Thomas Schelling once stated, everybody ranks himself high in qualities he values. Careful drivers give weight to care, skillful drivers give weight to skill, and those who think that, whatever else they are not, at least they are polite, give weight to courtesy, and come out high on their own scale. This is the way that every child has the best dog on the block. Better than average effect. The finding that most people think they are above average on various personality trait and ability dimensions. The better than average effect. The humor of the above cartoon lies in the fact that most people are inclined to see themselves, and people connected to them, as above average rather than mediocre. Not that one where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and the children are above average again. David Dunning and his colleagues have shown that people form just these sorts of self-serving interpretations or construals of what it means to be, say, artistic, athletic, or agreeable, and that such construals are an important part of the better-than-average effect. They have found, for example, that people are more likely to think they are significantly above average in ambiguous traits that are easy to construe in multiple ways, artistic, sympathetic, than in unambiguous ones that are not tall, punctual. Also, when people are given precise instructions about how they should interpret what it means to be, for instance, artistic or athletic, the better than average effect shrinks in size. People also take advantage of another type of ambiguity that allows them to think highly of themselves, the ambiguity concerning which behaviors or characteristics count in determining what someone is like. People tend to judge other people, how kind, outgoing, or athletic they are, by the way they are on average, and yet they define themselves in terms of how they behave when they're at their best. If people unknowingly juggle the standards for what constitutes talented, considerate, or agreeable, it should come as no surprise that they think of themselves as above average. Self-affirmation. Affirmations are another strategy people can use to maintain a positive view of themselves. Steele, 1988. Self-affirmation theory focuses on people's efforts to maintain an overall sense of self-worth when they're confronted with feedback or events that threaten a valued self-image, such as getting a poor test grade or learning that they're at risk for a certain illness. Under these circumstances, people can maintain an overall sense of self-worth by affirming themselves in a domain unrelated to the threatened domain. Self-affirmation theory, the idea that people can maintain an overall sense of self-worth following psychologically threatening information by affirming a valued aspect of themselves unrelated to the threat. For instance, if you learn of threatening health information, you can restore the blow to your self-esteem by reminding yourself of, say, your artistic abilities or your close friendships.